Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So imagine a machine the size of a printer you could fit on your desk that could run hundreds of medical tests off a tiny drop of blood from your finger. It would catch things like cancer, diabetes, and HIV early, accurately, and at a very low cost. This would completely transform healthcare and save millions of lives. And this was the pitch that Elizabeth Holmes was making to investors about the Edison, a testing machine invented by her company, Theranos. She'd founded Theranos at the age of 19, and by the time she was 31, it was worth $9 billion and had become Silicon Valley's next big thing.
But we can't engage the individual in changing outcomes unless individuals have access to the information they need to do so.
Everyone wanted a piece of Theranos. The thing is, the Edison didn't actually work. In October 2015, things started falling apart. The Wall Street Journal published the results of a year-long investigation into the company, revealing questions that were being asked internally and issues with the tests. The Edison tests weren't accurate, and Theranos had been using already existing commercial lab equipment instead. Then came the investigations from the FDA, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And in 2018, Elizabeth Holmes and her former boyfriend and Theranos COO Sunny Balwani were indicted by a federal grand jury. And now her trial is finally underway. Jury selection started this week, and she's facing charges of fraud.
When you're a doctor from Mount Sinai Hospital waving red flags and you're up against a hype machine like Theranos had built, nobody was paying attention.
Jason Kirby is a reporter for the Report on Business, and he's been following the story. He's going to tell us what to expect from the Elizabeth Holmes trial and what its outcome could mean for the culture of Silicon Valley. You're listening to The Decibel. Jason, hi, it's great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too.
So Elizabeth Holmes started Theranos in 2003, and by 2015, the company was worth $9 billion. Now, Elizabeth Holmes is on trial for fraud. And tell me about what she is actually accused of.
Well, exactly that. All of those claims that she was making, that these machines that they developed would give patients a chance to basically diagnose themselves by ordering their own blood samples and finding out all of these claims that they were making that were leading this company to be worth $9 billion. Prosecutors basically alleged that it was all fake and that they knew it was fake when they were telling investors and their retail partners, making all these claims. And what's more, a lot of the tests that they were doing, they weren't even using their own machines for. They partnered with Walgreens, the pharmacy chain in the States. And what was actually happening was they were taking the blood samples that was often taken from people's arms anyways. They weren't even drawing it from fingertips like they claim, but people who went in were getting blood drawn from their arms in vials. Then they were shipping it off to their labs where they were running the tests on commercially available lab equipment that they were buying from third parties and running the tests in-house and then making this claim that they were actually doing all this on their Edison machine. And none of that was true.
I've been following the story for years. I listened to the Dropout podcast. I watched the movies and all that, partly because Elizabeth Holmes is such a compelling character. Can you tell me a bit about her persona and what drew people to her initially?
Yeah, I mean, she was kind of this Steve Jobs-like entrepreneur character. She certainly presented herself that way. She marketed herself that way. She wore the black turtlenecks. She had a lot of quirks. She had this really, really engaging stare. She never blinked. When she talked in interviews or at conferences, she spoke with this extremely low baritone voice that seemed unnatural. And as it turned out, probably was unnatural. She was young. She was blonde. She kind of didn't seem like a lot of the other billionaire tech startup, heads of companies. And so she really kind of stood out on that front. And it made her just a really compelling person.
Right. And she dropped out of Stanford at the age of 19, right? And she was seen as this genius or a prodigy or something.
Yeah, very much so. One of her advisors at Stanford had said, mentoring her would be like trying to teach Beethoven to play piano. It all just fed into this idea that she was a super genius, and she claimed to have come up with this new technology that would allow a way to revolutionize the way blood is collected for diagnosing illnesses. And, it really just, at that time as well, in the 2012, 2013, there was just such, Silicon Valley was really on the rise, and there was just such fascination with everything that came out of that place. And so she just stepped right into that.
Right. And so until now, how has Elizabeth Holmes explained or defended her behavior or what she's alleged to have done?
Her claim has always been that everything was on track and that the claims were true. Up until this point, anytime that she was challenged or questioned about it, she would just say, well, this is what the haters try to do. When you're an innovative entrepreneur, they attack you, they try to tear you down. And I don't know whether she actually believed that the technology could eventually be made to work. I mean, there's this ethos in Silicon Valley of fake it till you make it. This idea that you can go out and you can make all these claims, even if your software or your technology or your innovation isn't quite ready to be released commercially. But you can still, go out and make the big claims and raise the money and, you tell that story. Like Silicon Valley loves a good story. And that's how you raise your capital from investors, from VCs. And, and with the idea that eventually you will make this technology work.
Right.
She could potentially have believed that her stuff would work, but that seems so unlikely because what she was claiming was so far away from what the reality of what these machines could actually do. It was not like they were at beta and they were just close to just being able to, release this commercially. It was nowhere near. It wasn't in the realm of ready.
Right. And even if she was doing that, even if she was operating on this ethos that Silicon Valley has of like fake it till you make it and building this narrative around yourself just so you could get the money to perfect that technology, even if that was true, in this particular instance with Theranos, what was wrong with that? Like, what are the stakes here, if you can give us an idea?
Sure. Well, I mean, the stakes, for instance, when you're developing a new way of delivering cheeseburgers to people at house is one thing. That's one thing if you haven't quite got the technology ready. This was dealing with people's lives, their health, their wellness, putting that at stake, making claims that people could self-diagnose and discover that they did or did not have a particular disease based on these blood samples that they were claiming they could take and analyze. That was putting people's lives in jeopardy. And we don't really know how many people who used these samples ended up getting misdiagnosed as a result. I mean, in the end, Theranos had to withdraw tens of thousands of test results that they'd issued. But people in the meantime made decisions based on those results. This was dealing with people's lives. This was playing a game with people's lives. And that's really why prosecutors have gone so hard at her on this, because this wasn't just faking it till you make it on some nifty software innovation. This was putting people's lives in jeopardy.
Yeah. And so the jury selection in her trial has just started. And I wonder, these people who took the tests and who made decisions based on these tests, are we going to hear from them during the trial?
Yes, we probably are going to hear from some of them. We're going to be hearing from doctors. We're going to be hearing from patients. We'll be hearing from some investors who have put money into Theranos based on all of these claims. So those are definitely going to be part of the prosecution's case as they try to prove the fraud allegations against Elizabeth Holmes and later on Ramesh Balwani, who was her kind of chief operating officer, president, and secretive boyfriend at the time that Theranos was doing all of this. He's going to be tried on the same charges later on in January, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that they were originally supposed to be tried together, but now they're being tried separately. And what are the implications of that?
From what we've learned from the defense's arguments in this is they're going to be basically making the case that Mr. Balwani was 20 years older than Elizabeth Holmes, and that he was kind of had this hold over her. And all the things that she did were because he was basically forcing her to. They're going to make a case that he was abusive and was forcing her to do all this? I mean, I'm assuming that they're going to admit that, yes, it was all a lie, but that it was because he made her do it.
And what else do we know about what her defense strategy could be?
Well, I don't know if this is going to be explicit in the defense strategy, but it's certainly going to hang over the case. In June, Elizabeth Holmes gave birth to her first child. So she was pregnant during some of the pretrial meetings that they were having in court. It's really an open question of how that's going to influence the jury in making their decision as to whether she's guilty or not. And if she is found guilty, whether that will influence the judge when he hands down the sentencing. There's definitely a lot of cynicism around the timing of her pregnancy. A lot of people close to the case believe that she got pregnant and timed everything so that it would add to, basically put her in a more sympathetic light at this time. Wow. And fair or not, this is a woman who's spun so many lies and deceptions that it's bred that cynicism about anything that she does.
You wrote in your piece that this trial is about how a world that's obsessed with Silicon Valley's startup culture missed so many obvious clues that something was wrong with Theranos, and how so many people poured their money into the startup. And in your piece, you go through a bunch of factors that led to this, and one of the things that you highlight is the makeup of the board. So who was on the board of Theranos, and how did the composition of the board help the company?
Well, it was a who's who of old white male power brokers. You had Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, former secretaries of state. You had former General James Mattis, who became former Secretary of Defense. So you had all of these really powerful people who helped draw in investors by having those big names on the board. Investors would have thought, well, if they're on the board, this must be fully legit. Right. What was completely missing from the board was anybody who knew anything about diagnostic technology, medical devices, or any of this. Mm-hmm. There was nobody who could ask any difficult questions. There really wasn't even anybody who could ask difficult questions on the financial side, let alone the complex claims that Theranos was making on the medical side. They weren't even asking questions about how, what the cash flow was like. This company was making all sorts of claims about how much money it was bringing in when none of that was true, and the board doesn't seem to have even been able to stay on top of that.
And why is it important who's on the board? Like, what is the board's role in holding a CEO accountable?
Theranos was incredibly secretive to a paranoid level, the way they structured the company. Employees weren't allowed to talk to each other from one division to the next. No one really knew what anybody else was doing at the company. Obviously by design, so that no one could figure out that the company was making all of this up. But the role of the board is to do exactly that. It's to, the fact that none of the board seem to have ever even seen this process in action, the devices in action, is pretty astounding. But even if they did, none of them had the understanding of the chemistry and biology needed to understand how this worked. How do you run 30 tests off of a single drop of blood? How are we doing this when no one else in the world has been able to do it? How do we do it? And, anytime that she explained her technology, it was always in these really general terms that anybody in the industry was left scratching their head. She didn't seem to have much of a depth of understanding of how the chemistry was supposed to work herself. So that would have worked with the board that didn't itself have any idea what was going on either.
Right. The other thing is, you'd think that there would be a lot of government oversight over a med tech company like Theranos. And I wonder, how did regulators not catch its issues for so long?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that there's loopholes that they were able to exploit. The FDA, the way they operate is they allow certain institutions to develop tests themselves, use the lab tests in-house, and without ever having to, subject the process for testing to regulators. It's basically a way to allow medical schools and some hospitals, research hospitals, to do research work and develop new technology and develop new tests. Because Theranos they developed this technology themselves, they claimed, and they were doing these tests in-house. For those reasons, they were able to slip through that loophole. It wasn't until after, in 2015, late 2015, there was a Wall Street Journal story that kind of broke open a lot of the revelations about Theranos and raised all these questions. It wasn't until after that you really started to see regulators take note.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because there were people asking questions, though, like this Toronto-based doctor named Eleftherios Diamandis. He'd been looking into Theranos' claims because Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, where he worked, was considering adopting the technology at the hospital. And he was one of the first people to raise red flags. And he warned in 2015 that Theranos' claims were speculative at best, that most of them were exaggerated. And why didn't investors pay attention at the time? Was it because they just didn't want to know?
Well, part of it was his paper was published in a fairly obscure biochemistry industry academic journal. That compared to the cover of Forbes or Fortune or Inc. or Wired, it's hard to get attention to your warning signs when you're up against that kind of media force and a hype machine. But he put out his paper in 2015. There was another doctor in the States who'd raised concerns about the secrecy around the company. Dr. Diamandis, what he did was basically started to pull apart some of the specific claims that the company was making. He didn't have access to the machines, of course. Nobody had access to the machines, so he couldn't run tests himself to see what it was like. But he was looking at some of the claims around cost savings and speed. And the claim that this was a key part of the Theranos marketing was that people would be able to do their own tests and get their own results and analyze it themselves. And it was going to be the democratization of blood testing. And he raised some really serious concerns there about that, the dangers of false positives and false negatives in results, and people simply not having the capability, the understanding to interpret their test results, and that they might make decisions based on those results that could be detrimental to their health. So he kind of laid all this out, and then eventually did another 5 or 6 papers in journals as we started to learn a little bit more about Theranos throughout 2016 and after that. But that was the beginning. His first one came out in May 2015, which was really one of the first red flags being waved. It's just that when you're a doctor from Mount Sinai Hospital waving red flags and you're up against a hype machine like Theranos had built, nobody was paying attention.
For so long, the coverage around Theranos was favorable, right? How did tech media contribute to the hype around this company?
The Theranos story really exposed kind of the unhealthy relationship between tech media and Silicon Valley and startups. The role that tech media played in building that hype. Everybody wanted to have her on their cover. Everybody wanted to tell her story. In the stories that were told, there would always be some section in there where the reporter said, hey, I tried to get access to the technology, but they wouldn't allow it because of trade secrets. That was always kind of like a clause in there. And it really, there weren't the tough questions being asked. Everybody just wanted to tell this fantastic story of this young woman who was revolutionizing healthcare. And it was just such a compelling story. And too few people ever stopped to ask, is this real? I think that since Theranos, there's been a change. You do see a lot more skepticism towards Silicon Valley in the years since, partly not just because of Theranos, but the role that Silicon Valley companies like Facebook have played in political events over like the last 5 years, 6 years, and just the disruptive role that these companies have had on society. There's a lot more skepticism now in tech media coverage of the industry than there was at that time.
And has that skepticism translated to investors? Like, are investors doing a bit more due diligence when it comes to companies like this? How have things changed in that sense?
Well, what's interesting about Theranos is that they didn't actually raise much of their money, hardly any of their money, from traditional Silicon Valley VCs. If you look at who the big names that were putting money into the company, there was the Walton family, behind Walmart, Rupert Murdoch, Betsy DeVos, who later became the education secretary under Trump. They were dropping in $150 million into this company. None of them had any understanding of the technology either. None of them were actually asking any questions. What we do know is that when Silicon Valley VCs did try to run due diligence, anybody who did ask those difficult questions was basically rejected as an investor. You basically had to agree not to ask any questions if you wanted to be an investor in this. The good news is that this all ended before Theranos was able to get to that stage where they started raising capital from the broader public.
So what do you think is at stake with the outcome of this trial, both for Elizabeth Holmes and more broadly for Silicon Valley?
Yeah, well, for Elizabeth Holmes, what's at stake is up to 20 years in prison. But there's also other things at stake in this. And it really comes down to that idea of the fake it till you make it ethos. And, if she were to be found guilty and she's punished with a substantial time in prison, that's certainly going to be a wake-up call to entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who might think that, hey, I can do anything I want and get away with it. On the other hand, if she is acquitted, they might say, yeah, I can do anything I want and get away with it. Look what she did. Look at the lies she spun, and she still was able to get out of it. There's certainly a precedent here that could be made with this case in how Silicon Valley operates.
Yeah, really looking forward to seeing how this all unfolds. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Jason Kirby. You can find him on Twitter at Jason_Kirby. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. We always want to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.